Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's presentation. We're still admitting a number of people, but given it's now after 12, I think we'll make a start and just keep letting people through. So welcome to today's webinar. Our webinar hosted by my institute, the Institute of Child Protection Studies at Australian Catholic University, with support from Hockey Australia and funding from the National Centre for Action on Child Sexual Abuse. As you can see on the slide, the topic of today's webinar is Safeguarding Children and Young People in Sport, the State of Play. My name is Professor Daryl Higgins, and I'm Director of the Institute of Child Protection Studies, and I'm going to be facilitating today's presentation. We're very excited to deliver this webinar today, and our audience comes from a wide range of organisations within and outside of sport across Australia and internationally. They may be watching now, or in fact, they may be watching the recording later on. So that's just a reminder that we are recording this webinar. So please, if you have any concerns, feel free to turn your video off and to either change or remove your name if you want to remain anonymous. We're going to post a recording of this on our ICPS Institute of Child Protection Studies YouTube channel and email a link to all the registrants who may want to catch up at a later date. And we will also make a copy of the slides available too, so look out for that. But before we get started, I would really like to acknowledge country and pay respects to the First Nations people attending today. I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri lands in the lands of the Kulin Nation, and we all together honour and pay respects to elders past and present and extend that acknowledgement to any First Nations people globally whose lives have been affected by colonisation. We acknowledge the many thousands of years in which First Nations people have raised children to be safe and strong, and acknowledge the spirit and the courage of victims and survivors of child sexual abuse, exploitation, and violence. Their efforts over many years have inspired our commitment to make changes at every level to better protect the children of today. I mentioned at the beginning that we have been very grateful for funding from the National Centre for Action on Child Sexual Abuse. And it really is about driving a vision of child safety that is central to the work of the National Centre for Action on Child Sexual Abuse, who funded this project as part of a competitive grants round where they allocated nearly $3 million for work on communities in which children are safer, and victims and survivors of child sexual abuse across the lifespan are supported to heal and recover. And so today we're going to be hearing about a project that we were successful in receiving a small grant in 2022 to conduct this research on continuous quality improvement in safeguarding at Hockey Australia and other national sporting organisations. So as a background to this, in 2021, Hockey Australia developed what they call Safe Hockey Framework to address the sport's response to children and young people's safety and wellbeing, including the ongoing threat of sexual abuse and other types of harm. So we at the Institute of Child Protection Studies work closely with Jared Dowdy. And sorry, I realised I've forgotten to push my slides along. I'm just going to do that. We worked closely with Jared Dowdy from Hockey Australia, who led the project with support from Samantha Dellamarta, a safeguarding specialist. Our Senior Research Officer at the Institute, Douglas Russell, worked with Hockey Australia on this project. He's leading a range of different research in two key areas. So the participation of children and young people in child-safe organisational practices, and also the safeguarding capabilities of staff and volunteers to prevent and respond to organisational child sexual abuse. And his expertise in these two areas have been invaluable to this project with our partner, Hockey Australia. So he managed the deployment of our two key surveys, the Children's Safety Survey and the Safeguarding Capabilities Surveys for this project. The surveys helped to evaluate the effectiveness of Hockey Australia's Safe Hockey Framework by measuring both children and young people's perceptions of safety in hockey, and our survey measuring how capable staff and volunteers who are working in safeguarding, working in hockey generally, feel about their role as a safeguarding person within the sport. So Douglas's background is as a qualified primary school teacher with 15 years experience teaching in Australia, UK and Dubai, and his key focus has always been on the wellbeing of children. Douglas is currently undertaking a PhD with the University of Melbourne, investigating the cognitive development and the relationship between sex hormones and neurocognitive development in adolescence and the effect that puberty blockers may have on this. We're also delighted to have on the webinar today, Samantha Dellamarta. Sam worked with Hockey Australia, bringing her expertise in safeguarding children. Sam works with clients through strategic partnerships to bring about a shift in policy, practice, and culture to prevent child sexual abuse in institutions and ensure children and young people are and feel safe and welcomed. But before I hand over to Douglas and Sam, I am going to, see if I can make my screen work. Just give a little background. I was very privileged to be one of the chief investigators on the Australian child maltreatment study. So it's the first nationally representative sample of all forms of child abuse and neglect in Australia. And we heard from 8,500 Australians about their experiences of these 5 forms of abuse and neglect. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of a snapshot around the prevalence of sexual abuse. So we found that 1 in 4 Australians have experienced child sexual abuse. So that's 28.5% of the population. And you can see it ranges in different forms. It can be a form of non-contact sexual abuse, such as asking somebody to do something inappropriate, to touch them, etc. Or it can be actual touching, attempted forced sex, or actual forced sex. What we see, though, is that in this data, there is a really clear gender divide, that in most instances, girls were at greater risk than boys. The only setting where girls experienced less sexual abuse than boys was in institutional contexts. We also have done some detailed analysis led by the lead chief investigator, Ben Matthews, looking at who it is that is engaging in this sexual abuse. So we had 7.8% of the population experience sexual abuse at the hands of a parent or an adult caregiver in the home. Another 7.5% experienced it at the hands of an unknown adult. 2% experienced it at the hands of an institutional adult caregiver. And that could have included in an institutional context, such as a sporting organisation, or it could have been an unknown adult, 4.9% of the population. But what's really important is to also remember that we had over 12%, almost 13% experienced sexual abuse from another child or young person who they knew. And another 1.4% experienced it from someone who was another child or young person who they did not know. So we know that harm is not just from adults, and harm is not just in organisations. It occurs in a range of families and different settings. We had a significant number of young people answer our survey. So we wanted to oversample, if you like, 16 to 24-year-olds. And what we can see is some slight differences. We actually see a lower prevalence rate for this group. So there are some signs that different forms of abuse are changing, and sexual abuse is one of those where it is slightly less likely to have happened for young people compared to older Australians. But it's not even across all forms of child sexual abuse. What we see in particular is that rates of sexual abuse at the hands of other children and young people, whether known or unknown, particularly those who are experiencing at the hands of someone who was or was in a romantic relationship with them at the time, is substantially higher. So we know that these are the kind of contexts in which sexual abuse is occurring right across Australia. And organisations like sports organisations need to be aware of that very high prevalence of child sexual abuse, including from other children and young people. So with that background, I'm delighted to now hand over to Douglas, who's going to share some of the detail about the project that we undertook, and then he'll hand over to Sam to provide some further context.
Thanks so much for that background, Daryl. So, Daryl's just given us an idea of the overall view of abuse and maltreatment across Australia, not specific to sport. What I'm wanting to do now is to look more specifically at the research in relation to sport. Now, I'm not sharing my screen, I don't believe. Yes, I am. So, there, and just like as in other organization types and in the home, there are different forms of abuse that may happen in relation to sexual violence. And that's not my first slide, my apologies. Sorry, everyone, give me 2 seconds. And there was me hoping that was going to go smoothly. There we go. Apologies. Let me start that again. So, just as Daryl was saying, that there are issues of abuse and maltreatment, and including child sexual abuse in a range of institutional types or organization types, as well as in the home, there is clearly also interpersonal violence in sport. And there's been some great research internationally, but also here in Australia, that identifies the level and prevalence of overall violence in sport. So this research wasn't specifically looking at sexual abuse, but we can see that 4 in 5 people experience some form of interpersonal violence. Psychological and physical violence were quite high, but also sexual violence was experienced by more than 1 in 3 people. And some other research in the sports sector specifically has identified how every participant that they researched had experienced violence from a coach at one point or another. So sexual violence and abuse was the focus of our research, and there are different types of sexual violence that can occur, as Daryl has just made clear through the ACMS, but that research has also happened in sport. So things like inappropriate touching or sexual comments, but also coercion and exploitation. There's also obviously, sexual abuse that involves touching, and, all forms are there. The impact has been researched in sport, and similar to the impacts that we see in other areas, there's emotional distress, there's trust issues, there's difficulties in relationships, and obviously long-term psychological issues. Disclosure, we know, is a difficult thing for young people and adults alike to do. There are low disclosure rates for fear of not being believed, for damaging reputations, and in sport, there's that particular factor of a fear of losing out in their participation within the sport, which can form a really important part of the identity of young people and adults who, find that sport is part of their community. So again, some research here from Australia, from the wonderful researchers at Victoria University, just highlighting how there is a normalization of violent behaviours in sport. And I know recently I follow Dr. Mary Rosner on LinkedIn, and I realised that I myself, had this kind of thing. Well, I might not say I'm a victim survivor. I did experience in one of my sports, the principal of the studio saying, give me 5 minutes with them in another room and I'll make sure that they're getting into the splits. And that kind of thing was just normalized at the time. Luckily, the dance teacher didn't think that the same trick was required. So psychological safety and recommendations. So there is already a look in the research into what do we need to do to look at not only what are the negative aspects and a focus on abuse, but what do we look at in relation to protective factors. And I know from my research across many sectors that often we're looking very much at risk factors as opposed to protective factors. And I think that that's an area that we can continue to look at, both in general, but in sports specifically. Things like the absence of fear, threat, and anxiety, and obviously positive relationships are all things that can help in relation to that. So there's already some recommendations in relation to what needs to be done in sport to help make sport organisations and clubs safer for children and young people, and for the people that work in them as well. So education and awareness for all stakeholders, supportive policies and procedures. And I think linked to that is this one here in blue of the culture change. So again, making sure that we're not just looking at a tick box exercise of, are we meeting the minimum requirements? Have we got a working with children check for everyone? Okay, great, we've done all that. So let's just, get on with what we're here to do, which is, teach and train and play sport. Looking at independent oversight, I know that Sport Integrity Australia is working hard to support sports clubs and organisations. Obviously, there's issues in relation to funding with anything that's sort of government focused, and also we'll talk later about some barriers in relation to research and developing an evidence base for this, but also access to psychological support and safe disclosure spaces. So I think accepting the fact that despite all the work that we do, there's always going to be changes that happen, new coaches that come on board, new play locations that a team might play at. And because of those changes, we need to be aware that, we now need to think about what are the risks now, and that there may be some times when disclosure needs to happen, or a raise of a safety concern, or indeed abuse may occur, and we need to look at a response. So today we're going to talk mainly about a project that we've developed, and as Daryl said, was funded by the National Centre for Action on Child Sexual Abuse. The aim of our project was to evaluate the change in athletes' perceptions of safety, and also the adults' capabilities to prevent and respond to abuse after implementing the Safe Hockey Framework. So we used our safeguarding measures, and I'll talk about those a bit more after Sam's spoken about the actual intervention and the framework. We targeted state-level representative teams, so we targeted athletes and staff. And the idea was that the surveys would capture the athletes' perceptions of safety in hockey before and after this intervention or these strategies is put in place, and also whether the capabilities of the adults responsible for the athlete's safety had changed at all. So I'll talk more about the pre-post design that we implemented later, but we definitely wanted to utilize the data that we received at the pre-intervention to inform the content that was delivered through them. So, noticing where there were issues in regards, or gaps in regards to capabilities, and making sure that the framework targeted those gaps. And then the post-intervention to see if the framework was effective in, making those changes that we were hoping would happen. So I'm going to hand over to Sam, who's going to talk about the project, the framework, the interventions that were put in place, and then I will wrap up with what we found through our analysis of the data. Sam.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. As both Daryl and Douglas have mentioned, my role has been to support Hockey Australia over the last few years around their implementation of safeguarding practices and policies and resources. And it started sort of nearly 6 years ago. So we had been providing running different pieces of work and strategies to start to build that awareness and education. And what we thought would be a great opportunity is to now sort of tidy it up, pull it in together. We had a lot of shift when Sport Integrity Australia came in, and there was some additional support and new policies in place. So we really wanted to kind of test it now, bring it together and package it up, and then see if we could use the surveys to try and gauge whether there was any sort of shift in the experiences of children and young people, but the confidence also that the people who were responsible for them, so technically our staff, but volunteers and coaching teams around their safeguarding requirements. So this seemed like a great opportunity, and we wanted to focus on when we were selecting participants. So we thought we would focus on our state teams. We were looking at the National Indoor Hockey Tournament because it ran over the same month. So all of those age groups were sort of back to back rather than if we went through the outdoor tournaments, they were sort of spread out over the whole year, and it would take us a long time to kind of gather all that information. So we also wanted to pull apart and have a few different groups. So we wanted to have some study groups where we could focus on the response of athletes who received the interventions, and then ACT was going to be the responses from adults who received the interventions. Queensland, we would catch both, and then we would have our control groups, which were the other states. In South Australia, we're not involved just because they didn't have teams going to that particular tournament. So we used both of those surveys, the Safeguarding Capabilities Survey that was used to go out to our volunteers who were in those roles, some of which had been around many of them had been around for a while and had been involved in some of the other safe hockey work that we had rolled out, and some of them would have been new to this as well. And then also running the Children's Safety Survey, which really looked at the experience of some of those young people. And we started running safeguarding education in 2019 at an under-13s tournament. And so there will be a lot of those young people that have moved through the ranks now and would have been listening and hearing some of these messages for quite some time. Again, we would be having some of the younger ones coming in, and it would be the first time they'd be hearing it. So in terms of recruiting participants, I'm very mindful, having worked alongside Hockey Australia and a few other sports over the last few years, that it's a lot on everybody's plate. And so asking them to say, can you please also recruit some participants for research was tricky. So we wanted to provide as much support in that space as possible. We had developed safe hockey leads in all of the states who were not, that was not their only role. They were doing a million other things, but we were also had given them the title of the safe hockey lead, and they would be able to kind of do some of the groundwork for us when we were recruiting those participants. We sent emails out via the safe hockey leads, and some of the emails we sent out via the CEOs because we thought it might have a bit more push to get people to sign up to do the actual surveys. We also created videos for parents, athletes, and the adult participants so that when it went out, if they didn't have to read a ton of information, they could watch a quick video. It would make it easier for them to understand it. Because it's not just a survey, it's research. There's obviously quite a bit of information that needed to be shared alongside it. So that we hoped that we provided that in those videos that went out in the emails. We had prizes and incentives for the young athletes who completed both the pre and post surveys, and we sent some follow-ups. Now, I recognise we were sending this out in December, leading into implementing the interventions during January at the tournament. So it was a busy time of year, Christmas coming up. So we ended up doing the follow-ups just so that we could keep some momentum. This is just a quick screenshot of what those emails look like. So we did a spiel about the survey. We had the videos in there. We also had to provide access to the parents to provide consent for their young person to then be able to do the survey if they were under 16, which just added an extra layer, and we'll talk a little bit about how that may have been a barrier later. So we didn't want everybody to go off to these tournaments with no information about safeguarding, because that would be irresponsible. So we had some standard interventions that everybody got, because we wanted to make sure that at the very least they had the initial information. And then what we were going to do is build on that for our study groups. So we have a Safe Hockey online course, and that course has been provided and has been for the last few years, and we've adapted it. So that was something that went out to everybody, and that way across both the study cohorts and the control cohorts. In terms of interventions for the coaching teams, we had everybody, this again was information that had to be disseminated via the states out to their representative coaching teams. We asked the study groups to then go and do the Safeguarding Children and Young People e-learning course from Sport Integrity Australia. We also gave them access to what we had was a Safe Hockey Overnight Travel Guide, which would provide more information about implementing safeguarding strategies when travelling with those young athletes. We also provided them some guidance around the expectations of their teams to deliver key safeguarding messages to the young athletes while they're away. We wanted to keep the message going. We wanted it to be not just something they did once in the online course and never heard about again. So what we did is created little scripts that would go out to the coaches so that they could send them out through their group communications through the week, or they could get in front of people and say it. In the past, when we've talked to young people about the best way to get these safeguarding messages, there's lots of ways. And one of the things is coming from the coaches themselves or the important, trusted people in their lives. So we wanted to try and make sure this message was coming from kind of from every angle. So we provided information out to everybody as well around who they can talk to and how to make a complaint. So this went out to those coaching teams so they could disseminate it to their groups, and it would have the information for their staff, who to contact, and it would also have a QR code to access the Safe Hockey resources online, and some information around how to contact Sport Integrity Australia. So we were just trying to make sure that we had consistent information going out across the board. Again, when we didn't want to just say to coaches, can you remind everybody about safe hockey? So we literally wrote them a script. They did not have to read it, but it just was a guide so that they had the right language, could reinforce some of those messages when they were sharing that, and they could put it out through a text message. They could also stand in front of the group at the initial briefings and share that. So again, the idea is that message was being repeated from a number of different angles. Again, with check-ins, we wanted that information to go out at the beginning. So we would have had those athletes listen, do the online course, then they would have turned up and have their coach to reinforce that message. And then during the week, that text message going out to say, just checking in, hope everyone's having a great week. Remember to do A, B, and C, and here's how you can contact us if anything doesn't feel right. And then again at the end as well, because sometimes what we have found, particularly trends coming out of incidents and issues that happened at tournaments, is it's not until you get home, think about the issue, talk to a parent, that those complaints would come through. So the idea was following up afterwards, a couple of days after it finished, with another message just saying, thanks for a great week, but remember, here's how you can raise your concerns. So these were some of the interventions that we'd put in place for the study group. Obviously, as I said earlier, the control group got a really basic intervention, but we built on that with these extra bits and pieces so that we could really hope that that message was being flooded. In the past, when we've done this, we might have me presenting at a group or an online course or some posters, but we hadn't really pushed that consistent messaging. So that was what we were trying to achieve, which would enable us to then use the survey to measure how effective that was. So for a number of reasons, our numbers were low, which, you know, for the people that supported the project, both at all of the member associations and on the ground, and the people that did the survey, we're really, really appreciative of, but we didn't get the numbers that we really needed pre and post, and probably the post numbers were difficult. I think one of the things would be from that is we sent the post survey out at the end of the month being up, but some of those teams played at the very beginning of that month, and so it was kind of weeks before that post survey came out. Also the timing, it was January, so all the pre-stuff was happening right up until Christmas, and the post stuff was happening as soon as school started, and that in itself could be challenging. We decided to go out again. We went out to the under-18s tournament, which happened, I think, in July. The reason we chose the 18s was because we could then eliminate the consent issue, and those athletes could get the survey link directly because they were over 16. We did inform all of the parents, and we gave parents the option to do that, but we could then get it out to the athletes directly, which we thought might just limit some of the email fatigue that parents were getting, which might have been a barrier. So we went out and got some more data from the second deployment, which was in July for the under-18s outdoor tournament. It might have just been fatigue by the end of it. There's lots of emails going out, and people had kind of finished the tournament and gone about the next thing for the year. So also just email being the form of communication. I'm probably not the only person in the room to know that can just be really difficult for people to just keep on top of those, particularly when it has links in it and things that they have to take to the next step. So that might have been able to play a part in that as well. Certainly, safe hockey, the term safe hockey has been threaded through, particularly at a representative level, the narrative for a few years now. But yeah, I think that might, from the conversations that we had, they may have been some of the barriers that slowed down the response rate that we were getting as we went through. But we're really excited to have the people respond that we did, and really interested to see where that data would take us. That's it from me.
Thanks, Sam. So I'm going to go over the results of the actual research aspect of us evaluating the Safe Hockey Framework and its deployment along with those strategies. So I've put up here the numbers for the responses that we had. And as you can see, as Sam had pointed out, our pre-intervention response rates were better than our post-intervention response rates. The other finding we had here is that the athletes responded in much higher rates than coaches or adults related to the teams did. Whether or not that speaks to the fact that athletes were offered a prize and adults weren't, may be the case. So I think in our next project with sports, we will be offering something to say thank you for the people who have taken part in our project. As a result of the lack of post-intervention data, we're not actually able to analyze in the pre-post design that we had planned. So what I'm going to present are findings of just the pre-intervention data. So the two surveys that we use, the Safeguarding Capabilities Survey for adults and the Children's Safety Survey for children and young people, which is what the athletes filled in, is we also use these with organizations that are looking for a snapshot to understand what they need to do next over the next 12 to 24 months in order to improve the culture of safeguarding and to improve their strategies and to think about what policies and procedures they might want to put in place. We've been using both the surveys in that way since 2018. And as we said at the beginning of this presentation, we use those findings to really make sure that the strategies we were deploying as part of the framework were really targeting the things that needed to be said. So what you'll see over the next two slides, first I'll do the athletes' findings across 5 different sets of questions, and then the adult or coaches' findings. I keep saying coaches, but it wasn't necessarily just coaches that were filling it in. It's other adults as well. So we had the 4 different groups that Sam had pointed out. The control group that received none of the sort of specialist intervention, the group that received only the coach's intervention, a group that received only the additional athlete intervention, and then the group in Queensland that received the adult and athlete intervention. What you'll then see is a total mean score for those 4 groups. So in other words, the entire sample. So we had 89 athletes who filled in the survey before the tournament and before the intervention was put in place. And then what I've also got here in our blue bar is our 2024 report data. Now, one thing to keep in mind as we're looking at these results is the huge disparity in the numbers here. We're comparing a group of 89 young people who have filled in a survey from one sport in the sector of sport. And we're essentially comparing that with almost 5,000 young people who are not just in sport, they're in schools, a large proportion of them are in schools, I should say, out-of-home care, and other such organizations, youth development, that sort of thing. So it's not necessarily a like-for-like comparison, but it does give us the ability to do a sort of rude comparison in a way. So what we can see here is that the Child-Informed Organizational Indicator of Safety Climate, or KIOSC, scored from 0 to 2. Hockey actually scored slightly higher than the overall 2020 data we've collected from 2018 to 2024, meaning that young people actually think the climate of safety in hockey is slightly better than what other kids are saying about other organizations. Now we look at the confidence in adults in regards to two situations, an adult situation. So it's a hypothetical cartoon scenario that's played to young people doing the survey that shows an adult that might make them feel uncomfortable. It's kind of related to, sort of looks like it could be grooming-esque. And again, we can see that hockey, the young athletes that answered our survey, again, are quite confident that the adults at hockey would be able to support them ever so slightly more than what we see in the 2024 report data. Again, about 90% of that I can tell you now is kids replying in response to the schools that they go to. We also have confidence in adults for a peer-based situation. So you'll recall earlier Daryl had pointed out how peer-on-peer use of harmful sexual behaviours is a concern. This was an area where hockey, the participants and athletes did not have as much confidence that adults could do something compared to those responding to other organisation types between 2018 and 2024. Again, it's only a very slight lower score there. The last two, the last set of questions we call barriers to help seeking. Again, this subscale within the Children's Safety Survey is asked in regards to both the adult situation they've seen and the peer-to-peer based situation, which again is about a 1 minute scenario. It's specific to the organisation they're responding to. So our hockey respondents in this project responded to a scenario that talked about young people at sport. The kids replying in relation to their school are responding to a scenario that's based at a school. I think Maria's probably hopefully going to be putting some examples. Here we are. I can see them going up there now in the chat. Thanks so much, Maria. Please, if you've got questions, either put them in the chat or my contact details will be at the end to answer those. Again, here we can see that hockey's done slightly better than our 2018 to 2024 report. So again, a sign that even without an intervention, just looking at all the work that hockey's done up to the point where we deployed the Safe Hockey Framework in these particular strategies, that there were less barriers to help seeking because of that high score there. And again, we see the same thing in the peer-based scenario, that should say, sorry, not intervention, that they again feel that there are not as many barriers to help seeking as young people who have responded to other organisation types. So I want to move on now to the adult capability survey findings, because they actually paint a different picture. But again, we need to remember here that we're looking at, almost a third to a quarter of the sample size that we had for athletes. And again, a much, much, much smaller sample size compared to our report. So this might look very different if we were to say, be able to collect data just even at a snapshot level, where are sports at, and maybe we collect data from 20 different sports. If we were funded to do that, we might be able to have a much larger sample size and be able to really make better comparisons with other organizations and sectors, which isn't necessarily even the most helpful thing to do, but looking at what are some of the specific items or areas within each of these capability areas needs to be worked on. So we can see that compared to adults who respond in regards to other organizations they work at, like schools, this is not 90% schools. This is a much better split between youth development organizations, out-of-home care. Schools are involved in this. But we can see a slightly lower score on the awareness of policies, procedures, and the culture of safeguarding. We also see a slightly lower score in regards to confidence to act. So should they see something that they're concerned about, like an adult behaving in a particular way that's against the code of conduct, for example, do they feel confident that they would speak to that person? So again, the small number of adults that we had responding in our survey and in the project scored slightly lower there. Again, a slightly lower score in the scale that we call attitudes. So the attitudes domain scale generally scores quite high in relation to people within organizations that work with youth having quite positive attitudes to the importance of safeguarding. Now, a low score doesn't say that they don't have positive attitudes towards safeguarding, but it may be attitudes towards very specific aspects of safeguarding. For example, one of the questions asks, it basically says working with children checks are sufficient and we don't need to do anything beyond that. And obviously, people who agree with that, we might be concerned that their attitude to safeguarding is not what we would want it to be. So it's those sorts of attitudes that this scale is looking at. And again, we can see that there's a ever so slightly lower score here in relation to that with hockey compared to our 2018 to 2024 report data. Knowledge is the one subscale or domain within the survey where participants in hockey scored higher. It is the smallest domain. It has the smallest number of questions, but it's knowledge about situational prevention and also the importance of children and young people's views being heard and considered. So it's great to see that this is scoring high, slightly higher than our 2018 to 2024 report data. And really can give us an idea of what are the sorts of things that hockey in particular could be targeting. But as I said, just because this is what's happening in hockey doesn't mean this is what's happening in other sports. There's lots of different work happening at different levels. I know gymnastics is an example. We've worked with them before. And I know an ex-employee who's done amazing work there. So their results may be very different here. So again, really looking at are these survey tools something that could be useful in at first getting a snapshot, and then as a sector helping us to really understand where do we need to go next, what are the kinds of things we need to target with interventions, and then how do we overcome some of these barriers that we faced in our research in relation to this. So the first two conclusions we draw here, I want to draw specifically in relation to this project, which is hockey as an example of a sport is doing as well, if not better than other organizations in respect to young people's perceptions of safety. So that's a great sign because we know that young people's perceptions of safety and listening to what they want is, it's a legal requirement in some states. And it's a great and important way that we can, as we know through the research, to ensure that safeguarding practice is achieving what we want it to achieve. The results do show us that there's more work to do in ensuring that adults are aware of policies and procedures, the importance of the culture of safeguarding, and also feeling confident in considering safeguarding from their role specifically. And I think Sam touched upon some of the barriers that might be related to this, talking about the safe hockey leads as that being an extra job on top of their standard role and the busyness of everyone. These are all things that, that specifically people working in the sports sector, I think, need to overcome, which is, a difficult thing to do. But there's also barriers like there are in other sectors in relation to conducting safeguarding research. And I think particularly the use of an experimental design here, the fact that I haven't been able to present, this is what we saw before and this is what we saw after, because of those low response rates in the post-intervention data is something we really need to work on. And one of the solutions for that, again, I know that the researchers at Victoria University do some very good research with huge sample size numbers, identifying protective factors, risk factors, issues and concerns, merging some of those methods with an experimental design to make sure that we've got the sample size we need to be able to do this kind of analysis. So I just want to bring your attention to the fact that here you can see an image of a sort of matrix here. And here what we've done is organizations that sign up and use the surveys either to get a snapshot or as part of an experimental design, they get access to these sort of, and you can access these regardless of whether you're signed up or not, links of our survey items to the national principles, sort of a major link and then a more minor linked one. And so really helping organizations, if they've been audited or if they're looking at specific areas that they want to improve on, really, taking that snapshot with the survey items and going, hey, this is what we need to work on. Here's how it links in with these national principles and things like that. So there are lots of barriers that we've seen. I can see some questions popping up. So I really don't want to focus too much on these. I think that many of you might be aware of these. Many of you are working within the sector. And so I think that there's already an awareness of these. I think that what's important to consider is that when I've got these up here, this is in relation to the participation in research in relation to safeguarding in sport. It's not just purely in relation to safeguarding in sport, although there's definitely some crossover. For example, I think the multiple levels of involvement as a systemic barrier is one that we've come across a few times in our research, again, across multiple sectors. Often there's an overarching group that really sees the importance of collecting data and utilizing that as part of an evidence base to support the work that's getting done. And then that moves down to maybe some sports organizations and national sports organizations. That then moves down to the state level, which then has to move down to the club level. And once it filters down all those levels, it's like, I'm looking at my coffee machine thinking that's using those same coffee grounds for the fourth time, and they're pretty weak at that point. So working out how do we, as a sector and as collaborators in research and practice, overcome a barrier like that. A logistical barrier is the volunteer status. Do volunteers really have the time to be filling in 15-minute surveys at particular times? How do we incentivize them in an ethical way that isn't, biasing our research, those sorts of things? And a lack of awareness, but again, not a lack of awareness of the importance of safeguarding, but a lack of awareness of the importance of research and safeguarding. I come from a teaching background, and I sort of realize now as a researcher how almost everything I did as a teacher relied on some kind of evidence base, either in psychology or educational research, the way we teach things, the way we manage behaviors in the classroom, the way we use positive reinforcement. So again, trying to support those people within the sector to really understand. And that's not saying there aren't hundreds or thousands of people that don't understand the importance of that. But getting the people, on the ground, those coaches that don't have that time, it's really a lot of intersecting barriers, I think, that we need to think about trying to overcome. Now, we do have an athlete story. I think originally Sam was going to present this one, but I'm happy to, Sam, based on the fact that I've got the talking stick at the moment. This was a story that really spoke to me, especially in light of the fact that we didn't get the data that we wanted to sort of do the pre-post evaluation of the deployment of the Safe Hockey Framework. But what happened was it came to our attention that a young athlete had a coach that was behaving in I believe it was a coach, behaving in a particular way and didn't feel that this was a concern. And I think the parents had even spoken to the child and said, we saw this, or, they talked about it, and the young athlete had said, no, it's not a problem. That's not a problem. I don't see anything wrong with this. They then took part in the Children's Safety Survey as part of the pre-intervention for doing this project, and then went back to their parents and said, I think that what this coach is doing is a problem, and I think we need to speak to someone. And my understanding, if I'm not wrong, and correct me if I am, Sam, that a report did happen. I believe there was an investigation, and there were some other concerns as well. And so that has been followed up. So, by all means, we really hope that our research can support change at a huge level. But I think just having that small change in that one club is definitely a win that we're proud of. So before we finish up, I just want to make sure that you've all got our contact details here. We will be sending out a version of the slides to people, and those contact details will be there. I'm at the Institute of Child Protection Studies, and I'm the best contact in relation to research and evaluation. Sam, obviously, is great in relation to strategies and policy questions due to her work as the primary consultant at Dellamarta Consulting. So thanks so much, everyone. That's our presentation finished, and I can see we've still got some time for questions. So I'm going to hand over to Daryl.
Thank you, Douglas, and thank you, Sam, for that really enlightening presentation. And yes, there are a number of people who've posted in questions. The first one from Mark is really one, I think, for you, Douglas, asking about the process of getting consent, if you like, to contact children. So when involving participants under the age of 18, how did it actually happen? How did you get to a young person completing a survey?
Yeah, I think that might even be a dual question. So with the ethics for the survey that we use with young people, anyone 16 and older, we don't need parental consent. A lot of organizations do seek it. And one of the difficulties with the fact that we don't necessarily need to get parental consent is, do we have a direct email or form of contact that's appropriate to the research, the way we're deploying the surveys for those young people? If it's, everybody's in a room and the web link goes up and they're all jumping on their phones, because you can do the survey on your phone, then that's potentially easier. But if we only have a database in the club with parents' emails, then it may be that parents are just told, your child can do the survey, please open the survey, and give them the phone, the tablet, or the laptop. In that sense, you may still just get the parental consent anyway. But there are some organizations that have said the need to get parental consent is a barrier to strong young people's participation in the survey. That wasn't necessarily the case with this project, where we saw much higher participation from young people. I'd have to defer to Sam actually to say, with those ones that were 16 and older, how was hockey able to get that to them? Did it still go to parents essentially, just without that sort of ethical requirement?
In most cases, I think it went to we sent an information email out to parents who were on file or registered for each of those athletes, which most of them had a parent attached to their registration, and let them know about it. But then they also, I think in most cases, they also had the direct contact details for those athletes. So they also just got the link directly. And yeah, I think that probably made that access a lot easier for those who wanted to complete it. Yeah.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks, Douglas. Rod's got a really interesting question, but I'm going to add a slight twist to it. He's asking about why it is that there seem to be consistently better findings for those in the group marked athletes only intervention compared to athletes and coaches. I think what's challenging is this is the pre-intervention data. So Douglas and or Sam, do you have any thoughts as to why there might be some group differences? So is there something about the groups that you selected for those interventions that meant those that were selected for the athletes only intervention tended to already have slightly higher, more positive attitudes, capability, knowledge of situational prevention, etc., than those that were selected for the athlete and coaches intervention?
Look, it's a great question, and if we had some bigger numbers, we might be able to draw on that a bit further. I don't want to call it a competition, but it is sport, so it's always a competition. It might just be down to the states and the way in which the states were able to get that message out to people. What we did was give everybody the information that had to be implemented. We weren't there to see it implemented. So I can't actually tell you how many coaches stood in front of their teams and said, this is the message about safeguarding 3 times in the week. So some might have been better at that than others. Yeah, I think probably, I don't know, Douglas, if you want to add to that, but it's probably hard to give any solid conclusions around it. There are a few variables that might have contributed to that outcome.
Yeah, I mean, our groups were formed by different states. So essentially, one state does seem to have, if it's the athletes or if it's the coaches, just potentially, their messaging or their use of that sort of standard intervention stuff that Samantha had spoke about that had been happening for the years prior. But I think Sam raises a great point, which is the fidelity of the intervention. So again, a really important part of a really rigorous research study that's going to use a pre-post design is, how do we really check that, if we're saying that these text messages or that this speech happens 3 times in the space of a week, that it actually does happen. And every additional task or activity that it comes into a research project is going to cost. So as much as there's a funding problem in relation to safeguarding in sport, there's, potentially equally an issue with how much funding is available for research. Is there funding for people in the actual organizations that are collaborators as partners, to have someone to manage research time and things like that?
Thanks. And I think it's important to remember that the statistics that Douglas was presenting for the different groups, even though it was the pre-intervention, he's talking about fairly minor trends in differences. They were not statistically significant. So there was, not overlapping what we call confidence intervals. So treated as trends, not as large differences. And I think it points out that there is differences in readiness, if you like, to take on and differences in need to adopt safeguarding interventions, that not every single club or unit within a club is exactly the same. That's really what stands out to me from seeing your results. Rod has got quite a specific question. Did athletes in the athletes only group know that the coaches weren't involved?
No, there was not. They weren't specifically informed of that. If they were in that group, they were invited to do the survey, and they got those additional interventions. They received the additional interventions, but they didn't necessarily know that the coaches weren't doing their additional interventions as well. And because we had that standard intervention for everybody, the coaching teams in theory would have had a little bit of information going into it. But no, that wasn't explicit.
Thanks. And Sam, while you're there with the talking stick, Nikki's got a question around, other than that anecdote that Douglas shared, was there an uptick in complaints that were either received by Sport Integrity Australia from the sport of hockey or hockey integrity?
Great question. And I wish I had got an answer in preparation for this, because it would be good to know. I can't answer it directly about what the data look like, but I do know that post-tournament issues are pretty, there's generally an uptake when it comes to the end of a tournament for lots of reasons. As you can imagine, the risks shift when you go into those overnight travel arrangements. But no, I can't tell you if there was a direct one connected back to that, but it would be nice to find out.
And
Thank you.
And I'll add why that question is also so great is the sense that if our ultimate aim is to reduce abuse or prevent abuse in sport, measuring the absence of something is very difficult. And we shouldn't assume that the increase or a decrease in abuse, which is what we're hoping for, but would struggle to measure without, strong data, is not going to be mirrored with a decrease in issues being reported. If anything, there would be an increase. Yeah. And that's why having measures like the safeguarding measures that we've used and other tools is a really useful way of measuring, to an extent, the culture of safeguarding. Keep an eye out for an upcoming paper that Daryl and I have been working on that looks at what are the conditions of safety, what can we actually look at, and what can we measure to improve our confidence that young people are safe in whatever organisation or sector we're working in.
Can I just jump in too to finish up? For those who have a special interest in hockey and the work that's been done in hockey, when I came on board in 2019, there was no integrity manager, nobody receiving complaints unless they came through the CEOs or whatever. And quite a culture of, we're really lucky that this stuff hasn't happened here to date. And I can understand where that culture has come from when you haven't had lots of issues on your come to your desk. There is now a full-time manager and an additional resource in place managing all of the integrity work across Hockey Australia, including responding to incidents. So there is a shift, because exactly what Douglas is talking about, an increase in numbers does not necessarily mean an increase in abuse. It means an increase in people having the awareness and the confidence to report it, among other things. So I think that sort of highlights, outside of this study, just the progress made in hockey itself. And I imagine that will be the case in other sports because of the broader context that's changing over time. So just wanted to call that out to finish up.
And
Thank
I
you,
can see
Sam.
a couple
We're
of
out of time,
questions.
so I'm going to wrap up now. But thank you, Douglas. Thank you, Sam, for an amazing presentation. We have some questions that we didn't get round to, and I'll ask Sam and Douglas to
Yeah.
get back with responses to people who have asked a particular question. Please look out for the video recording of this webinar, which will be coming out to you along with a copy of the slides. So thank you very much on behalf of ACU's Institute of Child Protection Studies for coming along. Thank you to Hockey Australia for supporting us in this amazing work, and a big thank you to Sam and to Douglas for an amazing presentation. Join us next time. Thank you.